It didn't happen on television. There was no podium, no shouting match, no dramatic press conference. But when the pressure came from Washington, a demand tied to nearly $500 billion in trade leverage, Canada said no. And what Canada did next didn't just diffuse the threat. It permanently changed how the country survives economic pressure. Most people didn't notice it at first. But once the shift became visible, it was already irreversible. For decades, Canada's economy rested on one assumption: that access to the U.S. market would always be there. That assumption was never written into law. It was never guaranteed. It was simply trusted. Then tariffs arrived, and suddenly Canada was forced to confront a question it had avoided for generations. What happens when your biggest partner can shut the door overnight? Instead of scrambling to reopen that door, Canada made a decision that shocked even its allies. When U.S. trade pressure escalated, the message was clear. Even if it was never said publicly, access had a price, compliance had expectations, and dependence could be exploited. The numbers mattered. Nearly 3/4 of Canada's exports flowed south. Entire industries, autos, agriculture, energy, manufacturing were structurally tied to uninterrupted U.S. access. This wasn't just about tariffs, it was about leverage. For years, Canada had absorbed smaller shocks. Steel disputes, lumber conflicts, regulatory threats. Each time the assumption held things would return to normal. This time, they didn't. Inside Ottawa, the realization was sobering. If trade could be weaponized once, it could be weaponized again. And no country can build a stable future on hope. Most countries respond to pressure with retaliation. Canada didn't. There were no dramatic counter-tariffs meant for headlines, no chest-thumping speeches, no symbolic trade wars. Instead, Canada paused. That pause was the real break from history. Because for the first time, policymakers stopped asking, "How do we survive this?" and started asking, "How do we make sure this never works again?" That question led directly to one man. Mark Carney understood something many politicians didn't. You can't negotiate away structural weakness. You can only remove it. Carney's position was clear. Canada would not trade long-term vulnerability for short-term relief. No rushed concessions. No dependency disguised as partnership. Instead of accepting pressure tied to market access, Canada rejected the premise entirely. The old model, where efficiency meant dependence, was over. And replacing it would require something far more ambitious than a trade deal. Canada's response wasn't loud, it was structural. Rather than throwing money at temporary fixes, the government focused on one objective. Because leverage only works when there are no alternatives. So Canada began building them. Ports weren't expanded as projects, they were rebuilt as gateways. Rail lines were upgraded to move goods east and west, not just south. Energy grids were strengthened to support domestic industry, not just exports. These weren't stimulus plans. They were permanent escape routes. For decades, Canada exported raw materials and bought them back as finished goods. That ended. Critical minerals, clean energy components, and advanced manufacturing were brought inside Canada's borders. Once value stays home, pressure loses power. Instead of state control, Canada cleared the path for private investment aligned with national resilience. Rules changed, permits accelerated, barriers removed. Markets were allowed to work, but on Canada's terms. Diversification wasn't symbolic. Canada deepened real trade ties with Europe, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, India. These weren't backup plans. They were parallel systems. No single market would ever again decide Canada's fate. Once companies invest in new supply chains, they don't simply reverse them. Once relationships form, leverage evaporates. That's when the pressure stopped working. This shift wasn't painless. Some exporters lost ground, some industries struggled to adjust, some profits disappeared. But something critical changed. Instead of absorbing shocks alone, companies were given new markets, new tools, new paths forward. The risk was shared, adaptation became national policy. And something unexpected followed. For the first time in generations, Canada stopped defining itself primarily by proximity to the United States. The relationship still mattered, but it no longer defined everything. That mental shift was just as important as the economic one. Canada discovered that patience could be power, that preparation could defeat pressure, that leverage collapses when dependency disappears. Other countries noticed, quietly, carefully, closely. This wasn't just a Canadian story. It was a warning and a blueprint. In a world where trade access can vanish overnight, resilience isn't isolation. It's optionality. Canada didn't retaliate, it didn't escalate, it didn't panic, it prepared. And in doing so, it turned a moment of vulnerability into lasting strength. Canada didn't walk away from its biggest partner. It simply made sure it would never again be cornered by one. No headlines marked the moment, no speeches announced the shift. But the balance changed. And once it did, it couldn't be changed back.